Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand of the company Horns of Odin. As always, before we jump to the show, I do have to plug our Patreon. I say it every week. I say the exact same thing. Everybody's sick of it, but it is the lifeline of the show. It's literally how we keep going week in, week out, keep putting episodes out. So if you can, head over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast, and you can get the entire back catalogue that you can't get anywhere else. Over 310 episodes at this point. You get the Q&A that we do, which is a bumper part to every episode. So if you like a show with a guest, you get an extra part to that that's only available on our Patreon. And sometimes they last an extra hour. Sometimes they're 15, 20 minutes, but it's an extra bit with tons of information. Usually the guests let their hair down a little bit more. It's more relaxed, and they're well worth it. And just, support what we do, and you get to join our little Discord community with some lovely humans who've been around at this point 5 years, the whole journey, and they're very dear friends. So if you want to join that, head over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. Starts from £3 a month, less than a cup of coffee from me or Mags. And if you can't, just 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcast, or like, share, comment, hit the little bell, subscribe thing, YouTube, all that stuff. But let's get into today's show, because this is a topic that we have somehow overlooked for 310 episodes. We've not done a specific episode on this, and I don't know how. We've mentioned it, we've alluded to it, we've had guests quote it, but we've never just said this is the source, or this is what this is. So let's get to it. First, introduce my lovely in-house archaeologist and co-host, Mags Havgar.
Hello.
Didn't forget you.
Hey.
Doing good.
Can you tell that, I'm curious now whether people who watch the video edition of the episodes can see my stare, just kind of intensely looking at you to see whether or not you're gonna forget.
Sometimes I look awake, it gets a bit awkward. And our lovely guest today from my neck of the world, a fellow West Yorkshire lassie, is Tonicha Upham. So Tonicha is a postdoctoral researcher in the Centre for the World in the Viking Age in the Department of Archaeology, Ancient History and Conservation at Uppsala University. And the topic we are going to be talking about is Ahmad ibn Fadlan. Tonicha, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on your podcast tonight.
No, like I said before, you came with high recommendations.
Yes, I'll try not to disappoint this evening.
Wow.
Way to really kind of set the expectation, Dan, before we hit it. But we're so excited that you're here, Tonicha, because we have had this conversation, like we mentioned briefly before we started recording, that both the Dan and I are a bit how have we not spoken about this specifically? Because I do feel like Ibn Fadlan is a bit if you're in the Viking Age community, you know of it, but then it is kind of a what if you're not in the know?
Oh, absolutely. It's something that fascinates absolutely everybody. Everybody kind of has a little bit where they do Viking archaeology and then they're like, oh, but we should talk about Ibn Fadlan. We need this. This is a really useful source, but it means he's often on people's periphery.
Yeah.
So it's nice for him to get the attention he deserves. Although sometimes I think we make too much of him when there's also other sources we could play with. So I have a complicated relationship with him. But yeah, outside of academic conversations about him, unless you've watched The 13th Warrior, you don't necessarily know who Ibn Fadlan is, because he doesn't show up so much.
Yeah, I think as we said before, we should try to use this episode as an intro to, because we've never, we've never covered it. There's been countless guests who've used the sources when talking about other topics, but we've never kind of said, this is who he is, what he was writing, where we can find it, how much we can trust it, even down to, they're talking about the Rus Vikings. Is that reliable to compare to the Vikings who are then going into the UK? All these different topics, I think we should kind of try and just get that intro to
So we're just starting with the light and breezy topics tonight then. No difficult questions
no,
whatsoever.
No. We never.
No. It's one of those things that I think there's so much focus on the Vikings and the West and the UK, and then obviously Iceland and to North America. Also with the Christianization, that's like a big topic. I think the Arabic sources certainly get overlooked, and the links and the relationship. So looking down into that kind of Eastern way is refreshing. There's still loads to learn, I think.
Yeah, it's a huge field of untapped information, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess maybe we should start with something semi-easy then, which is just like, who was Ibn Fadlan? Like, what? Why do we talk about it?
I think inadvertently you've hit on the toughest question going.
I had a suspicion, so as I was saying it, I was a bit like,
Yeah, you're setting me up here.
Well done, Mags.
Okay, so Ahmad ibn Fadlan, to the extent that we know anything about him, he is important to us in the world of Viking studies, very broadly speaking, because in the year 921 AD, he set off on a journey from Baghdad. And the journey took a very long time. We know that he was still traveling in 922 AD. We don't know how long he traveled for because we don't actually know if he made it back home again, but he set off towards the Volga River, which is in what is now Russia, to use the modern borders and definitions. And Ibn Fadlan was part of a large party that had been dispatched by the Caliph, so the political leader in Baghdad, because there was a king up round the Volga River. The king of the Volga Bulgars had recently converted to Islam, and so he'd written to the Caliph and said, well, I'd like some money to build a fortress. I'd like some spiritual support and some help dealing with this new conversion and what I should be doing. Could you send some people? And Ibn Fadlan is one of those people. Whether he's a diplomat, which a lot of people argue, is a little bit difficult to say because he doesn't necessarily see himself as the diplomat in the mission. Some people have argued that he's a soldier. Some people feel that he's more of a missionary, but his role in itself is a little bit undefined. It's very difficult to tell what Ibn Fadlan thinks his purpose is overall. But in the process of this journey, he keeps a written record of what he's seeing, the people he's interacting with. And where that becomes important for us is that when he's traveling around with the king of the Volga Bulgars, he happens upon a party of people who he calls Russia. And they are trading on the banks of the Volga River, but most importantly for him, they're in the middle of a very, very lavish and very, very brutal funerary ritual when he comes across them. And so he makes a note of this, and he's important to us because he's created this huge written source. And the Russia, who he describes, or people we might call Rus, have a lot of very close links with the Vikings. And so people talk about Ibn Fadlan because he is essentially our only eyewitness who's written down what he saw during a funeral that a lot of people consider to be quite Norse or Viking in character.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there is this kind of assumption, I guess, to a certain extent, because he never uses the term Vikings, but that in archaeological and historical research, that kind of there's this assumption that Rus may perhaps be synonymous with Viking, and that perhaps this is a record of a Viking burial, and if so, it is the only eyewitness account of what we assume to be a Viking burial that we have.
Now, in that question, you thought your first question was easy.
I know, I'm aware. I can hear myself doing it.
A good 250, 300 years of very intensive academic debate. The idea that there's a connection between Rus and Vikings has been politically weaponized by various parties at various times, but the idea, most simply put, is that Vikings, obviously they wouldn't have called themselves Vikings, but that's a whole other issue. People from Scandinavia during the Viking Age set out towards the Eurasian steppe, were traveling along the river routes of Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, towards the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and slowly settling down, slowly becoming part of a new population who we might consider Rus. And we see a lot of the same cultural hallmarks among the Rus that we see with Scandinavians in the Viking Age. So there's been a real tendency to draw these connections. And in the case of Ibn Fadlan and the Rus that he describes, these connections have been obvious to scholars since the very first moment that this source was studied in a Western context. So the first time that Ibn Fadlan's name was used in Western Europe, it was used in a very Scandinavian, very Norse or Nordic context. They didn't use the word Viking at that point because they really hadn't developed a sense of what Viking meant in the early 1800s. But from the moment that Ibn Fadlan appeared as a source that European scholars were using, they were thinking, oh, that sounds quite Viking. That sounds like what we understand from the Old Norse sagas, or later what we understand from Scandinavian burial archaeology.
So could the Rus loosely be compared to, say, the settlers in England? That kind of idea of
is it kind of like a diaspora culture in a way, or?
I think it's fairly fair to say that there is something of a diaspora going on.
Okay.
That you have Scandinavians.
For the non-academic. What's a diaspora? It's okay. It's all right. I'm asking for the listeners. Of course, I know.
Yeah. Duh.
Okay, so when we talk about a diaspora in this context, what we're looking at really is we're looking at an extended community. We're looking at people at various places outside of what we might consider a homeland to be, who originate from this culture or have a sense of belonging with this culture. They might express that through their mode of dress, through their beliefs, and so on, their language, so on and so forth. There are various ways that they might express this or feel a kinship with people back in Scandinavia, but it's a term that we often use in scholarship on the Viking world just to kind of explain this process by which people might have settled, might have integrated somewhat with the local cultures. So in the case of the Rus, they weren't remaining statically Scandinavian the entire time that they were setting up shop along the river routes in the new towns and cities that were starting to crop up. They might have arrived initially as traders in the short and medium term, slowly setting up trading outposts and places so that they had somewhere to stay along very lengthy journeys, places where it was very helpful to trade or advantageous to start maintaining a base. But then they're intermarrying with the local populations, they're having children, they're settling down and slowly intermingling and becoming something that isn't exactly the same as Viking and is developing into other things depending on which part of the world you're in, but ultimately is something that academics look at and can recognize quite a lot of what we would consider Viking within it.
Okay. Is this the only mention he has of the Vikings, or is there more than this, or is there only like the one account?
From Ibn Fadlan?
Yes,
there is just this one account. We just have his journey from Baghdad to the Volga River, and the Rus weren't even on his itinerary. He wasn't supposed to meet with the Rus. He was there to meet with the Volga Bulgars, and it just so happened that as they were traveling, they encountered a roving band of Rus traders, as it were, and happened to see them. So it wasn't even part of his plan that he was going to see the Rus, far less that he would do anything like continue to Scandinavia, because he had already reached the target of his mission. We have to assume that at this point, once the mission had been resolved, and there were a lot of complexities there was a lot that was going wrong with his mission to the Volga Bulgars, but once all of that had been resolved, we have to assume that he would have turned around and gone back roughly the same way that he came until he got home again. We don't have any record of that return journey, so we don't quite know what that would have looked like.
Do you have writings from him after this? Because you said you didn't know whether he got back home, and I'm wondering how did his writings get back?
Well, that's a good question. We have only this account of him, and this is why I said at the beginning that asking who Ibn Fadlan is a very difficult question, because we only know of him from this account. There's no contemporary records that say, oh yeah, there was this man at court called Ibn Fadlan and he did X, Y, and Z, or he was a specialist in these things. All we have is his own testimony of this journey. And yeah, we have to assume that he got back at least some of the way, at least somewhere within the Islamic world, because otherwise, how would we know about his journey? How would we have this surviving account? But we don't have any of the details for the end of his journey.
Do we even know that he's a real person? Is that possible? Because if there's only, I don't know. I feel
that's
like
a good question, actually.
Because you have Snorri's writings, but then I assume you have other people who then mention Snorri in. Well, I don't know if that's true or not. But
we know, considering
writings,
the fact that we have a surprising amount of knowledge about Snorri's life.
Yeah, like from other texts. But if you don't have, if this is just kind of,
is Ibn Fadlan kind of like a Homer situation?
Is Homer? Is that what Homer's like?
I think we don't really know that much about Homer. I'm not talking about the Simpson character here, obviously, but as far as I'm aware. Again, I'm not a classicist, but we don't really.
I'm not that bad, Max.
I was speaking to our listeners.
Okay. Palm it off on them.
But I don't think we know all that much about Homer besides him apparently having authored the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say it was quite the same situation, because what we have in terms of this travel account isn't high art, I'm sorry to say. It's
okay,
not
fair enough. Yeah, sure. Yeah,
an absolutely breathtaking piece of literature. I mean, it's important. It's hugely important. You know, I make a career out of dealing with him. So no disrespect to the man. But in terms of this idea that maybe he wasn't real, that does come up now and again.
Okay.
I think my stance on it, until I hear a convincing argument otherwise, and I'm very open to a convincing argument otherwise, my stance is that somebody must have made some kind of journey. I think there's enough in the account that is erratic or not quite patterned enough for it to have been completely faked. You know, I just think the way that like things like speech appear in the account, it's random enough that I feel like it probably did happen in some way, rather than it being something that somebody's sitting in Baghdad somewhere, or not Baghdad as the case may be, because that's not where we're finding manuscripts, but somebody's sitting down somewhere and thinking, oh, I'm going to imagine what a journey would be like if you went up to the Volga River, and this is what you'd do and this is what you'd see. It just, to me, it doesn't read that way. And I think if we look at the Rus in particular, there are enough details about that funerary account, because the funeral is the big bit with the Rus, really. The reason he's so important is because he describes a funeral, and that's information that we don't get in the same level of detail from any other form of information, written or archaeological, about the Viking world. I think there's too many details, even if they're details that surprise us, that we wouldn't get from other sources, that you wouldn't know about. I think there's just too much detail for it to have been an elaborate hoax, because you wouldn't write in that much detail about such an insignificant people in the north.
Yeah, and also maybe like detail that wouldn't necessarily seem pertinent if you were trying to hoax. Like there's just like, a lot of weird info.
And also detail that wouldn't be very seemly or appropriate for a good Muslim man to write about.
Because this is the thing,
sexually,
right?
If nothing else. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of content in this account that is, let's just say, explicit and culturally very inappropriate to our eyes and ears, perhaps.
Yeah, and maybe now's a good time to kind of furnish that a bit, because I've said that Ibn Fadlan encountered Rus traders on the Volga River, and he describes them. First of all, he says, "Oh yeah, we met the Rusia. They'd come to trade. This is what they looked like," and he describes what they're wearing. He describes what they're trading, which is slaves. The Rus are human traffickers. He describes the beads that they're trading. They like these green beads that they keep on their ships. And he describes the whole process where they leave out offerings for the gods to secure good trades. They build these longhouses, 10 or 20 of them to a house.
Does he describe how they may or may not have decorated their skin?
He does, and I was hoping we would glide past that one. But he does describe, when he talks about the appearance of the Rus, he describes how they have dark markings or patterns along their arms, and that has often been interpreted as a sign that the Rus had tattoos. He doesn't necessarily indicate that these markings are permanent, but he does say that they've got these artistic shapes and patterns on their arms.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as an academic kind of party pooper, I will jump in here and say very quickly, it could have been charcoal. Like, there are so many things this could have been. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we should automatically equate them to tattoos.
No.
That is one of many options, but there's nothing saying, these are tattoos, guys.
No, but I think that it's hard to gloss over because it's in the modern day. Most people, I think, will know of Ibn Fadlan from this argument around tattoos over the more important kind of ritual burial. I would say, I think people may know like information of the burial, but I would
so
say
interesting because I've never heard that angle at all. But again, maybe I'm too academic into like my spheres are too academic. Perhaps I don't know.
I guess that most people that just have heard of Ibn Fadlan through this tattoo argument because he's the saving grace for the pro-tattooed. Yeah, he's like the one that you can't disprove either. They can't prove it, but they can't be necessarily disproved.
Such a great argument.
It is though, but it's that one thing that can always sit there where it's like, well, he described this.
There is a definite maybe here, guys.
Yeah, well, that is exactly what it is. It's a we don't know, but it's a pretty fucking solid we don't know. So you can't get rid of maybe. It. It is, so you can't get rid of it. So it's always going to keep coming back up until we find something better. This argument is just going to be perpetuated by this. But we've got Ibn Fadlan, and then people are like, but we don't have any bodies and we don't have any tools, and it's just this cycle that goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately for that argument, Ibn Fadlan is not witness to a live Rus tattooing. I think, maybe if he'd watched some tattooing going on and then was able to write about it. Or maybe he did. Maybe that just wasn't something that he bothered recording because obviously over such a long journey, he did still have to be quite selective about what he thought was important enough to include in his account. So really, we're very lucky that what he thought was important to include was a description of a Rus funeral, because he does his due diligence with all of the people that he encounters on his journey to the Volga Bulgars. He's kind of like asking his translators and his informants and everybody, what these people are like, so that every time he gets somewhere new, he can kind of describe what the people are like, what they do. And one of the questions that he seems to often ask people is, well, what do they do with their dead? And presumably when he asked that about the Rus, somebody said, well, they set fire to them. But sometimes they do more than that. And he was like, well, this sounds absolutely unbelievable. But then he's lucky enough to see it.
No, when he's like, I don't know, I feel like if I just came across some people that were so culturally different to me, and then they treat their dead differently, and then there's this ritual which is quite graphic and I would say, quite horrendous to view. That would terrify the life out of me, because I wouldn't know whether they were going to kill me or I don't know. I feel like he's a little bit blasé about it all.
I think you're absolutely right that it's terrifying, and you've also got to bear in mind that Ibn Fadlan is doing this. He's a long way from home. At this point in time, he's essentially a political prisoner of the king of the Volga Bulgars, because I said that the king had asked for money to build a fortress. Ibn Fadlan arrived without the money because there was an issue along the way that meant that the money didn't catch up with them. So he's kind of an extended guest of the king of the Bulgars until this situation is resolved. So he's already in quite a tense and unsettling situation. And then he's introduced to these people called Rus, and they're in the middle of what must be like beyond his absolute worst nightmares. And to that, we've also got to add that the idea of burning the dead, to us today, that seems quite neutral. Plenty of people practice cremation across different faiths all around the world. For Ibn Fadlan, the idea that you would burn a body as a Muslim man, that's horrifying to him. Around about the time that he's writing, burning was used as a punishment only very, very occasionally for the absolute worst crimes in the Islamic world. So the idea that the Rus are these people who are voluntarily doing that, never mind everything else that they're doing, is horrifying. And for me, I think it's one of the great ironies of the account is that when we get to the Rus, and he only sees the final day of a funeral. This funeral has already been going on for 9 days when Ibn Fadlan gets there. But he's seeing things on the 10th day. He's seeing the ritual assault of a slave girl who has supposedly volunteered to be killed. He's seeing animal slaughters and sacrifices. He's seeing this boat being banked on the river and being assembled with all sorts of finery and then set fire to. He's seeing all of these absolutely horrifying things, and slowly what he does is he quietly retreats. So as he goes through the account, he's always quite proud of being able to indicate what he understands and what he's picking up on and how he's acquiring his information. When he gets to the funeral account, he starts saying things like, oh, and the translator said this and the translator said that. And what he's doing is he's just reporting what the translator says to him. And this means that a lot of the people who doubt Ibn Fadlan's authority and accuracy as a source will say, oh, but he didn't understand, he's using the translator. But I think what he's kind of doing is he's putting up a bit of a shield to kind of distance himself from what he's seeing, so that he's just using the translator's understanding when he's getting most uncomfortable, because he's terrified. There's all these things going on. It's noisy, it's getting dark, there's fire, there's people screaming and being killed. Not to mention that he's missing the Friday afternoon prayer. So in terms of his own feelings about his faith and what he's doing, he is foregoing a really important event in his week in order to watch this absolute depravity.
Yeah, the rhythm of his life and his culture is thrown off course. And there isn't really, unless I'm mistaken, the few times that I've read this account, I've never picked up on whether he has been prepared or whether this has been described to him beforehand. So I feel like this distancing that he does, I feel is really well, it seems clear to me as a reader now still of that kind of dissync that you get where you're just so overwhelmed by everything, and probably also being frightened, like you said, just needing to kind of taking a step back mentally, kind of lightly disassociating in a way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And we don't know exactly how much Ibn Fadlan's been told before the funeral, but what he says is, oh, I'd heard that they set fire to their important men when they die. Sometimes they do more. So I was keen to see that for myself. And sometimes they do more is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting there in terms of exactly how much more they do.
Yeah.
And so I think the way he kind of frames it, because then he's like, oh, and then I learned that an important man was dead. And you can kind of sense the excitement that he's getting to see something, that he's actually got a front row seat, that he'll be able to see it for himself and describe it for himself. But absolutely, towards the very end of his description of this funeral, he describes how the Rus men are talking to the translator, and he kind of says to the translator, well, what are they saying? And he's like, oh, they're saying, that you Arabs, you're foolish because you bury your dead in the ground. We've set fire to this man and we've burned him, and now his ashes are going to be carried away with the wind. He'll be with his Lord in no time at all. And once again, it's a conversation that Ibn Fadlan hasn't really participated in. He's just kind of stood next to the translator and said, oh, hey, what are you talking about now? It's not some real, at least as far as I'm concerned, it's not some great effort to communicate with the Rus via the translator and figure it all out. By that point, I think he's heard and he's seen enough. He doesn't want to sit anybody down and interview them about exactly why they've done what they've done, because he's just a bit traumatized and he wants to go home.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
But should we like go through kind of like do a quick run through for people, like what is this funeral that he's witnessing? What are the actions that he witnesses, that he describes? Just like, and then we can get into the gory details afterwards, but just kind of give people kind of the what is this funeral that we keep talking about?
Just obviously, just before that, one thing I wanted to ask is it possible that the king was just like, where's my money? I'm going to take you out to this really quite horrific funeral thing in like a kind of non-threat situation of like, well, if my money doesn't turn up in a week, that's you. And we don't know if he got back safe, so...
Yeah, I don't know. I've never considered the use of the Rus as some kind of tacit, underhanded threat by the king of the Bulgars.
Just be like, look, these guys, you might end up over there if you don't bring my money soon.
Yeah, I mean, there are arguments that there are other things that the king does that are kind of designed to unsettle Ibn Fadlan. So there's one point where Ibn Fadlan is told, oh, they have a giant. They have a giant. We'll take you to see the giant. And it's a dead giant that he's taken out to see the body of this giant. And the giant comes from a people known as Gog and Magog, who in Quranic terms, in a lot of Abrahamic faiths, are a monstrous people who at the end of times are going to kind of burst forth from containment and destroy the world. It's going to be
bad times,
some kind of catastrophe. And so for Ibn Fadlan, the idea that there's this monster that he knows of from the Quran who has supposedly been washed down the river and either died or been put to death, depending on which version of Ibn Fadlan's account you're working with. He's taken to see the bones of this giant, and he's really quite moved by the size of the giant and the magnitude of what he's being shown. So I think there's certainly elements where the king of the Volga Bulgars is doing what he can to think, well, we've got this guest and he's not doing what I wanted him to do.
Let's
he's
freak
not
him
got
out.
The money. Let's mess with him as best we can, without him really believing that he's being messed with so much, because he's just, at this point, he's so disoriented, he's so uncomfortable, he's so far from home that he's going to take them seriously with whatever they say. So I don't know, maybe the Rus are just the icing on the cake as far as that's concerned.
Like these savage people who treat people how they do compared to his culture feels like a big threat. That maybe when you said Gog and Magog, that reminded me of isn't like Gog Magog also like, I don't know if these must come from the same place, like a Welsh word for a giant, and that's what I was frantically googling, and like Gog Magog was a legendary giant in the matter of Britain, according to Geoffrey Monmouth's History Region.
The more you know.
Britannia.
Okay.
From the King of the Britons in the 12th century. And I'd only ever heard of Gog Magog through that setting. So when you said that, I was like, hang on a minute. I wonder if this, but surely that's too close to not be related. Gog and Magog, and then Gog Magog literally is just, you just remove the and the spelling is exactly the same as well.
Yeah,
this is a tangent. I think we should move on.
Yeah. I think that's very wise of you, because now I am sitting there thinking, what do I know? Where is the connection? So you'd asked about the whole funeral, Mags, and what that looked like. So maybe that's a good place to return to. So Ibn Fadlan, having been told that the Rus do something, he encounters these Rus quite fortuitously on the 10th day of their funerary practice. And I think he's very sneaky, because he starts by framing this funeral in a way that makes it seem like he's seen the entire thing, because he starts by explaining what happens at the beginning of the process, that when an important man dies, he's kind of briefly buried to kind of keep the body good while they're doing everything else. And they divide his wealth up into 3 parts. They have a third that goes to his family. They have a third that goes on the funeral garments, so the things that he's going to wear, all of the paraphernalia for dealing with his body. And then a third of his wealth goes on the alcohol that's going to be drunk over the next 10 days.
Hardcore.
I've been to some funerals like that, actually.
But maybe not quite like the rest of this, I think.
Or at
least I hope not.
Good disclaimer. I can
just the alcohol
clarify,
bit, not the rest.
Yeah, I can clarify not quite like what is to come.
Okay,
I would like to get that clear.
Good. Okay. And so what he then does, and this is kind of the precursor to one of the grisliest, most horrifying bits of this, for us today, but also for Ibn Fadlan. And I think that's important to emphasize, because quite often when I talk about this, people get quite annoyed and say, oh, you're applying your modern sensibilities to this.
No.
This was normal. This was the way it was done. And it's like, is it? So what happens is the family of the dead rich man ask all of his slave girls and slave boys, which one of you wants to die with him? And somebody will volunteer. He gives this, he kind of sets this whole tableau up in the abstract first. So he says, they ask the slave girls and the slave boys. Normally it's a slave girl who'll say, I'll do that. And then he says, in the case of the man who just died, they only asked the slave girls. So they asked the women, the girls who'd been enslaved by him, which one of you will die? One puts her hand up and says, I will, and they assign 2 attendants to her who go everywhere with her for the next 10 days. There's an element where they're like waiting on her hand and foot and looking after her, but essentially they're also guards to make sure that she stays where she's supposed to stay and does what she's supposed to do over the next 10 days. And so everybody starts drinking, they start preparing the boat that the dead man will be burned in. But the slave girl also has quite a lot to do as well. So by the time that Ibn Fadlan then arrives, and he quietly says, after he's done this whole thing where he says, in the abstract, this is how they ask the slaves. And then in this case, this is what they do, which kind of makes it sound like he was there for the specific case that he describes. After that, he kind of quietly slips in that he arrived on the 10th day. And he wasn't the only person who arrived on the 10th day of the funeral, because at the same time that he arrived, more or less, a strange old woman arrives. And he says the Rus call her the Angel of Death. And that's important that he emphasizes that this is what the Rus call her, because for a Muslim, the Angel of Death is a Quranic figure. It's a Quranic concept. But I think, like with the rest of the funeral making him uncomfortable, he's having to fall back on this idea that this strange woman who's arrived, and he describes her in very weird terms. He's kind of like, she's quite menacing, quite spooky. He's having to emphasize that, I know she's the Angel of Death, not like our Angel of Death. This is what the Rus call her. And so he's really insisting that this is the cultural term that's used. However, we want to speculate about what that might have been in whatever language the Rus were speaking, that it then got translated into a language that Ibn Fadlan would understand. But he arrives and she arrives at roughly the same time, and she is some kind of ritual leader. She arrives and he explains that she's responsible for killing the sacrificial victim, that she kind of prepares the body, sorts out what the man's going to wear for his funeral, all that sort of thing. And so she has had to be summoned from somewhere, we assume. And maybe that's why the funeral takes 10 days, because you've kind of got to keep drinking, you've got to keep waiting until she arrives, and you can't do the main part of it without her.
She might be booked up.
Mm-hmm.
She might
you
travel
never know.
around the different. It might be her gig, and that's.
Well, yeah. I mean, you never know when somebody important's going to die, and you're going to have to set fire to him on the riverbanks, right?
You don't know where the angel of death's going to be.
No,
she's never on time.
Like us.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. One thing I wanted to just quickly ask was you keep saying, the rich man. Does he never get named? Because I feel like that's an odd thing. Why is he never go through all these details? I'm sure he would have asked the gentleman's name.
Yeah, you would think, and this is actually one area that really bothers scholars, because to skip ahead to the end of the funeral, once the ship's been burned, the Rus build a mound over it, and they kind of leave a plank of wood on top of the mound, on which Ibn Fadlan says they've written the name of the dead Rus man, and they've also written the name of the king of the Rus. And he doesn't see fit to give us either of these names, which is absolutely bizarre when you consider that this is a man who will occasionally offer up little linguistic tidbits and, describe things. But yeah, the names of these people don't appear to be important enough for whatever reason. I don't know if that's because they sound a bit difficult to spell, or if he just wasn't listening, couldn't quite remember. But for whatever reason, that wasn't an important aspect of this for him.
That feels so bizarre to me. If I watched what he watched and saw what he saw, I wouldn't help but be able to remember the name.
But also here's also a thing though. Since he has this very clear distancing thing to almost this entire cultural event, I'm speculating here heavily, but not naming them, like the individuals involved, is also a very good way of not equating them to yourself, of keeping them as other.
Yeah.
He might also have done that unconsciously, but just not, because then they stay being them, those people. But as soon as you give it the individuals' names, then they're a bit more
real, a little bit less faceless mass of pagans that are far to the north and you don't otherwise have to really worry about.
They don't have names. I feel like that's such an odd thing to admit. But yeah, maybe it is just that. So,
but I don't know. Like as Mike says, by this point, it's just so traumatic because what I've described so far are just the bare bones of some of the key actors.
Yep.
But things really take a turn.
Now we're going to get into it.
He's watching. Yeah, and this is a bit where it does get quite disturbing, depending on your sensibilities here, because before the whole zenith of the ritual, before it reaches its high point in terms of everything going on and people paying attention, the sacrificial victim, this slave girl who has volunteered for something which she then cannot unvolunteer from. As soon as she volunteers, that's it. There's no going back on her word. She's placed under guard. She is kind of taken from kind of like tent to tent, effectively. And each man among the Rus, each of the other slave traders, has sex with her and says, when you get to the afterlife, tell your master, your enslaver, your lord, that I've done this out of love for you. Presumably out of love for the dead man, but a little bit hard to say there with the Arabic. And so she has been taken and she's incredibly drunk. She's kept drunk for the entirety of these 10 days, really. And she's kind of just led from tent to tent and from man to man. But then once they have the whole boat set up, so the idea is that there's this boat that's been pulled out of the river and there's kind of like some kind of tent or pavilion on board, and the dead man is laid out on there, and she's taken in there too. And this is where the angel of death really comes in. So she's had to manhandle the slave girl into the pavilion on board the tent, because by this point she's so drunk that she can't quite find the door herself. So she's kind of just like grabbed and pushed in. Because she's done her ritual bit. She's said, oh yes, I see my master in the afterlife. He's here. This is what the afterlife looks like. He's calling me to him. So it's time to go. She's led into this pavilion. And this bit Ibn Fadlan obviously doesn't see, so it's just described to him from the outside, but he can hear her screams, because 6 men go into this pavilion with the slave girl, the angel of death, and the dead man. And each of these 6 men have sex with her a final time. And then the angel of death sets things up so that this girl can be stabbed and strangled all at the same time. So there's an awful lot going on. And meanwhile, outside of all of this, the remaining Rus men are kind of banging on shields and creating as much noise as they can. And Ibn Fadlan, standing there, says, oh, that's to drown out the slave girl's screams, because if the other slave girls heard that, they wouldn't want to volunteer for this fate when their enslaver dies. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different layers, and it all gets very, very grisly even before they've set fire to the boat and started the whole process of cremation.
It's so terrifying, isn't it? Like, imagine just being there in that situation and in that environment. That would be horrific. It's very much something of Hollywood, almost, of a horror film. It has that feel to it.
Yeah, it really is. And I think the more you read it and the more you read it thinking about that, the worse it becomes in a lot of ways. And I often see arguments when I talk about this publicly that I'm projecting my horror at this onto Ibn Fadlan. But I think, even in a society that accepts slavery as totally normal, even in a society that would think that the sexual use of one's own slave girl is fine, even in a society like that, as far removed from our society today, the idea that this same slave would be shared out around multiple men like this in this drunken, drugged state, the idea that she would then be killed so brutally, I think there's no aspect of that you could look at and think, well, oh yeah, an outside observer would look at that and think, oh, that's totally normal, that's fine. Isn't that an interesting little way of doing your death rituals? Obviously it would be quite disturbing, even if it's disturbing for slightly different reasons than we find it disturbing today.
Is there any speculation as to why it would be so brutal? Like, why go through that length? Why not just kill? Because you would assume that the killing is so that she will be there in the afterlife, so the master has a companion. So why the brutality? What's the need of like making it suffer? It seems a little bit needless, I guess.
It's a good question, but were her feelings of any importance at all in any of this once she had said that she was going to go through with it?
But not just that, more the effort, even just the effort, even if you just reduced it down to her being a piece of meat that they didn't care about, there's still energy that goes into the brutality of it, rather than just slitting her throat and leaving her to bleed to death. That's the easiest thing, regardless, whether you see her as human or not. You want to, if it's the most efficient way, is just to slit her throat or run her through, and that's it, and be done with it. Why the this kind of strangulation, the stabbing? That is, there's effort to that, so you would assume therefore there has to be meaning to that.
I think also this is where kind of this account, and stop me if I'm wrong here, Tonicha, but this is where I feel like the account also leaves us with a lot of questions, because we don't really get any background into why these things are done. They're just described. So I agree with you, Dan, that like there has to be some sort of purpose, whether or not that is conscious, for all of these actions. But we only have the description of the actions. We don't have the intention of them necessarily spelled out for us. So we're forced to veer into this landscape of speculation immediately. But one thing that it also made me think about, which kind of, it makes me almost a little bit nauseous just saying it, but I think one thing that's important to remember when we're discussing that kind of the brutality of these actions is just to kind of note what we today consider to be brutality, because there is a point to be made that maybe these actions weren't considered brutal by the people doing them. To us, they seem blatantly brutal and unnecessary. They might not have seemed that way, or kind of that might not have been the way that they were viewed at the time when this occurred by the people doing it. So even the concept of brutality is up, like this gets so philosophical so quickly.
It really does. And Ibn Fadlan does not psychoanalyze the Rus. He does not sit there and say, okay, but you know, what happened to you as children, that this is what you think is appropriate in a funeral. He is not in a position to give us any insight into any of that, to have an idea of what the Rus considered to be brutal, because as it is, right at the beginning, when he's describing the Rus being 10 or 20 to a house on the banks of the river, he's describing how these slave traders have the girls that they are trafficking on couches in these houses with them, and they just assault them. And if somebody comes in wanting to buy a slave girl, they just continue having sex with them until they're finished and then deal with the sale. And so we are absolutely talking about a society with very, very different values from what we can imagine and what we sitting here today would consider to be in any way normal or peaceful or anything like that. And so you're right that this is a very, very different situation to be in, but we have no sense of the whys and wherefores of this. It's certainly on the much more brutal end of the scale in terms of the activity involved, and that's where we need to think about the fact that this is a funeral for a rich man. And I think that's the important part of this when it comes to the brutality and the violence, that if you're this wealthy that a third of your wealth can go on alcohol, and yet there's still a third left to maintain your family after your death, it's, you know, you're going to want a good send-off. There's going to be an expectation that there be some real effort put into a send-off, especially if everybody's kind of dropping everything for 10 days to honor you. You know, this is something that's at the absolute top end of the scale, really, when we think about funerals and public mourning and that sort of thing, because we have other accounts in Arabic of what the Rus do with their funerals, and none of them are as detailed as Ibn Fadlan. None of them are eyewitness accounts, but there's an account from maybe 20 years-ish earlier than Ibn Fadlan. The dating is a little bit uncertain, and it might be working on a source from the 9th century rather than the 10th. But there's a description by a geographer, because the Rus most often appear to us in geographical texts when we're looking at Arabic source material. But there's a geographer called Ibn Rusta, and he describes how for rich men among the Rus, a chamber is built as big as a house, and into this chamber is put the dead man and his weapons, his wealth, some food and so on, and also his woman, who is still alive when they seal up the chamber. And so he just kind of very quietly, very understatedly kind of says, and there she dies.
Yep.
And there's no real interrogation of what that means, but that's an instance where the sacrifice taking place is very much bloodless, that there's nothing that we would recognize in the same way as violence. So we have being buried alive, but we also have instances where the women are being burned alive. So, you know, in some ways, Ibn Fadlan, the fact that this poor woman is dead before the fire is lit is perhaps some kind of mercy, even if it's such a horrible way to go out. And so we have different expressions of violence and brutality, and what those all mean when you try and put the whole puzzle together, how they would have resonated with the Rus themselves, with onlookers, and so on and so forth, is hard to say. But there were a lot of different things that they did to their dead, and a lot of them would leave a sour taste in our mouths today, certainly.
Very much so. And also, like, in Ibn Fadlan's case, like, the position of the girl is like, she's described as a slave girl. And I think just the fact that, like, that they are given a choice, in heavy quotes, of whether or not to choose to be sacrificed is also very much up for debate. Like, what kind of choice is that really? Because I've seen the argument made that, like, oh, but, like, they are practicing consent because they get to choose. And I'm like, let's not even open that Pandora's box.
Does she really know what she's volunteering for? She can't say no once it gets started.
And I mean, just the sentence, the men began to bang on their shields with staves to drown her cries so that the other slave girls would not be frightened and try to avoid dying with their masters, implied that the slaves perhaps are not very informed as to what this entails.
Yeah, there have been arguments that this was Ibn Fadlan misunderstanding and that there was actually some ritual purpose to the noise. But I also think that if you're a shrewd observer who also, like the Rus, comes from a culture where there are slaves and there are slaves used for sexual purposes, not so openly as among the Rus, that's very inappropriate, but slaves can have sexual uses. And so for you to stand there and say, this is so that the slaves don't get upset, I think that's got to mean that it really is. Or at least that there's some kind of attempt.
Yeah.
But also, does it matter if they get upset? They can't do anything. And does it matter?
But they can refuse to volunteer. And that's well, this is the thing. Ibn Fadlan doesn't.
Would one not just be picked anyway? So can they really?
Yeah, that's the question, because Ibn Fadlan doesn't account for an eventuality in which somebody doesn't volunteer. And there are schools of thought that argue that if you're a slave, if your life is like the life that the slaves that Ibn Fadlan describes among the Rus experience, if your life is really like that, maybe choosing to die is a way of getting out of it, that it's an escape, because he doesn't specify exactly who these slaves are or where they came from. So we don't know whether these are slaves who are relatively local from adjacent cultures who might have shared the same beliefs about the afterlife, or whether these are slaves who have been trafficked from further afield, who maybe don't necessarily have a full grasp of the language, never mind the culture and the religious beliefs. We don't really know what it is that they're choosing when they say that they will die with the dead man, effectively. Now there is a bit where the slave girl is lifted over a door frame, and in being lifted over a door frame, she's able to see into the afterlife, and she sees the dead man, but she also sees her family. And that's kind of presented as a bit of maybe her status has improved in being sacrificed. Maybe this is a form of posthumous marriage. She's now his wife, and that's what this is like. And there are arguments with versions of this source where we can kind of see that, and there are discussions elsewhere of this idea that the Rus might have practiced a form of posthumous marriage. In this case, it's really difficult to say without specific details about this particular girl. It could well be that she had been fed the lines that she was supposed to recite as she was being lifted over the door frame. They're all quite neat in the way that they're repeated to Ibn Fadlan. So it could just be that she's told, okay, and in this next bit, you're very drunk, you need to remember these lines. This is exactly what you were going to say at this point in time, because that's what's expected of the ritual.
Or maybe she just never said any of it, and it was just passed on to the translator. That's what she said.
This is the thing. We can pick holes in so much of this as to exactly who's saying what and where it's all coming from. It seemed credible to Ibn Fadlan that that's what she was saying and what she was doing, but what that means in the grand scheme of things, it's harder to say.
I mean, that's what makes this source, I think, so fascinating, because it gives us so many surprising details. Like, not just the details themselves are surprising, but the amount of them and the specificity sometimes. And then on the other end of the scale, the lack of specificity on other things. And then just like, I feel like almost every single tidbit raises double the amount of questions than it answers as soon as you start to like look into it.
as an academic, Ibn Fadlan is absolutely exhausting, because every time you think you've dealt with something relating to him, something else comes up. And it's not even just what's in the text. It's that you think you have a handle on who's then using Ibn Fadlan, because we don't have like an original manuscript. We don't have his own written account. No, we don't have Ibn Fadlan surviving for a good 300 years after his journey. Maybe 250 if we're being generous.
Shit, really?
Yeah, in terms of extant, so surviving manuscripts, and partly that's to do with manuscripts surviving and things like that, but we don't have whatever paperwork he was keeping. We just have his account where it's been quoted by later geographers, or where it's been put together into different manuscripts. And some of those we can kind of trace their origins to like the 10th century, maybe like 50 years after his journey, but we don't have an official, there's nothing that says, oh yeah, this is Ibn Fadlan's diary.
Diary of Ibn Fadlan circa 10 blah blah.
Yeah, there's nothing like that. So we just have him in different forms from different texts. And that's been a very dramatic history over the last 2 centuries, as people have kind of worked with that and discovered manuscripts and things like that. But it means that every time I, as an academic, kind of sit down and think, I'm going to look at somebody else's geographical text today. I want to look at something else about the Rus. You sit down with a new text and you think, Ibn Fadlan isn't going to be in this text. I'm getting away from him. And then you start reading and it's like, Ibn Fadlan says,
God damn it.
Just think, for crying out loud, I was getting away from him today.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of perusing it before we started recording, and I was like, oh, well, thank God. In my PhD now, I don't think there's that much importance that I need to give to Ibn Fadlan. I deal with the Oseberg tapestries, and then I just came across one, excuse my French, but one fucking line that just describes the stuff in the burial, and he says Byzantine silks, and I went, no! No! God damn it!
Now, if you want to get away from that, the very first manuscript that was used by Europeans to study Ibn Fadlan doesn't have any Byzantine silks.
Oh, great, thank God. But
so just use the Copenhagen manuscript, and then you don't have to deal with him.
Great, because this seems like a whole big can of worms. But if I'll pose my question, and then I'll see if you agree with it. But I'm thinking maybe to end off the main episode, maybe we should get into kind of if you're comfortable with that, Tonicha, like the background of surviving Ibn Fadlan, like the fact that his surviving accounts are seemingly the way that you describe them, patchwork. Like, when do they start appearing? How? Because this is what we've talked about like ad nauseum when it comes to Nordic literary sources and the sagas and all that stuff. So maybe that's a good point to end on.
Most people probably assume there is just one book manuscript.
I mean, personally, text. I kind of did.
I did. Yeah, but I think that's the same with that's the same with like the Eddas.
Yep.
I'm pretty sure they're not unbroken from the 12th century. I think they're like the actual surviving ones from much later.
The thing is, books are notoriously perishable. Yeah. This is the problem.
It's frustrating.
To have books lasting this length of time. Come on, Ibn Fadlan was traveling north over 1,000 years ago. It's over 1,100 years ago. That's a really long time to hope that things will survive.
I mean, I'm looking at it right now. I have a Bible that I inherited from my grandpa that I don't think is from my family, but he was a pastor, so he got it from someone, I think. And the earliest notation I can find in that book, I don't think it has any publishing information, but the earliest notation I can find is from like the 1790s or something, and the book is falling apart.
I believe it.
Yeah, of course it is.
Nice. So anyway, it's just a kind of, and
yes,
that's pretty recent considering the time span we're talking about here.
Yeah. So Ibn Fadlan. Yeah. There's the most important bit is that there's 2 key ways that the text has been preserved and kept for us today. But when I say 2, what I really mean is that there's at least 14 different quotations, but the two most important are that Ibn Fadlan was quoted in a 13th century Arabic geographical encyclopedia, which was written by a man named Yaqut al-Hamawi. And Yaqut was a geographer, and he's writing this fantastic alphabetized dictionary of countries. And as he dips in and out of it with the different people that he's describing, so the Bulgars, the Bashkirs, and so on, and the Rus, he then quotes Ibn Fadlan. And he's writing a good 300 years after Ibn Fadlan's journey. And what he'll do is he'll kind of say, oh, and this is, I've taken this word for word from Ibn Fadlan's letter, and he calls it a letter. And he also says that Ibn Fadlan is an envoy or a diplomat, a messenger. And that's kind of the only space where we see Ibn Fadlan referred to as an envoy.
That letter's saying, get the king the money now. He's sending it back home like, get that money here. I want to go home.
How long is this going to take?
Yeah, I want to go home.
Guys, please help. Yeah. But he quotes from this letter, and he kind of hedges around the whole thing because, Yaqut is doing serious geography. He's trying to prove that, this is a worthwhile project. All the years he's spending compiling this great big encyclopedia. It's in I think my copy of it is in 6 or 7 modern volumes.
Jeez.
So it's a real lengthy piece of work when you consider he's writing it all out by hand. And so he's like, guys, I know that this is unbelievable. I know that today everybody knows the Rus are Christians, but this was just so incredible that I quoted it exactly as I found it. God knows if it's correct. I'm trusting him. I take no responsibility whatsoever for any inaccuracies in what he's saying. And so he presents these quotations that way. And this is the very first way that European scholars encounter Ibn Fadlan. So a manuscript arrived in Denmark in the 1700s. And in 1814, a Danish Orientalist named Jens Lassen Rasmussen wrote an essay for the Danish Royal Society about the Arabic and Persian knowledge of and writings on Russia and Scandinavia, he calls it. And he translates the bit of Yaqut that deals with Ibn Fadlan and the Rus funerary account. And then he says, we're not going to comment on that here. I'm going to leave that up to the Nordic antiquarians to deal with. But, these people look an awful lot like our forefathers. So they're kind of knitting it straight into Scandinavian history already.
Immediately.
Already saying, yeah. And that's because the Arabic sources that describe Scandinavia are all just a little bit weird and wacky and light. And, you have Scandinavians living inside hollowed out tree trunks. So I think on the balance of things, he preferred the image that Ibn Fadlan gave of these really brutal Vikings, as he saw, well, he didn't quite see them, but Scandinavians engaging in a ritual that felt a little bit like the Old Norse sagas. So we have this whole tradition with Yaqut, and what happened is then a lot of other geographers used Yaqut and were kind of condensed what they read from Yaqut down, or were copying it out. And that's why Ibn Fadlan survives in so many different weird trails today. And that's not only about the Rus, that's about other aspects of his account. So that giant of Gog and Magog, he is the best surviving aspect of this account in terms of the number of places that he shows up in different Arabic and Persian and Ottoman Turkish geographical texts. So there's that line of thought, but then there's also a compendium of 4 Arabic travel texts. There's a couple of travel accounts, there's a couple of geographies that were first put together in a compendium, most likely in the 10th century, but the version that survives for us is probably a 13th century manuscript that was identified in Mashhad in Iran in 1923.
But so that, just sorry to interrupt, but then if it was compiled in the 10th century and recompiled in, what did you say, the 13th?
13.
Yeah, copied out again.
Yeah, but that would then be closer in time to the first one that you described, or am I incorrect?
What, the copy?
Well, yeah, sure, either of them. I mean,
Yeah, and this is where it gets really complicated because we don't quite know if Yakut is using the compendium, if he's got access to different sources. This is where it gets really thorny in terms of who knows what. But in any case, this manuscript, the Mashhad manuscript, as it's often called, it gives us the fullest version of Ibn Fadlan's travel account as like one piece. So Yakut and all the other stuff, that's individual quotations. So for the first 100 years that people were dealing with Ibn Fadlan as a scholarly text, they were having to like piece him together from all the different bits to speculate about what the journey would have looked like and everything else and figure out exactly where he went. And then in 1923, this manuscript was identified in Iran under very dramatic political circumstances, because it was identified by a scholar who was also a politician, and he was a Bashkir politician. So he, up in Bashkortostan, he had been one of the initial leaders of his region after the Bolshevik Revolution, until he fell out with Lenin and Stalin, went on the run, ended up briefly in Iran, and that was where he found the manuscript. And at the same time that he's doing all of this work in libraries and looking at manuscripts and identifying the fullest and, really, really headline version of Ibn Fadlan, at the same time he's doing all of this, security forces from the United Kingdom, from Russia and from Persia are all tailing him because they're absolutely terrified that he's either going to start a Bolshevik uprising in Mashhad or he's going to start some kind of pan-Turkic, pan-Islamic uprising. And they can't quite decide exactly what kind of political threat he is, but they know he's definitely a political threat. And when he says to all of these agents who question him about what he's doing there, why are you in Mashhad? And he says, I'm here to look at manuscripts. They're like, oh, that's a feeble story. We don't believe a word of it. And yeah, at the same time that he's doing all of his political scheming, he leaves under cover of night with the postal couriers. This is a high pressure situation. But in the middle of all of that, he just casually goes into the library, looks through the catalogue, plucks a volume off the shelf and says, oh, hey guys, look, it's Ibn Fadlan. This is the fullest version of the account. Now it's time for a lot more scholarship. And so he's just, weighing up all the different things. It's a blockbuster movie in itself.
Talk about having fingers and pies.
Truly, it's utterly ridiculous. And it then meant that Ibn Fadlan was a highly politicized source for a couple of decades because, he told the librarians, he's like, guys, you've got this really important source. I'm like, oh, would you like to buy it? And he said, no, you can't sell it. This is important. And then they wouldn't let him look at it again. He left Iran. He ended up in Austria and then Germany, which weren't really good places to be in the 30s. He did eventually have to flee to Turkey. But for his PhD thesis, he translated Ibn Fadlan into German. Well, he'd been working on an edition.
Ooh.
And then he wanted to get it published. And he kept writing to his old colleagues in Russia and saying, does anybody know? Is anybody else doing a translation? Because this is my baby. I want to do this. And the Russians had set a Ukrainian Orientalist on the job because somebody like this man, his name was Ahmed Ziki Validi Torkan, somebody like him who was an enemy of the Soviets because of how things had gone down with his political machinations over there, they couldn't let him have first credit for Ibn Fadlan. So they had set somebody up to do a Russian translation, and they had an in with the Iranians, so they'd gotten hold of photocopies of the manuscript, so they had better access to the text for a while, and they published 6 months before he did.
Oh no!
Which was absolutely galling for the man.
That's got to be devastating.
Yeah.
So the manuscript was real, though he didn't just make it up. He had just, amongst all that craziness, he did just find.
Yeah. There was a manuscript, and people.
And it's genuine. It's not just like a fake or something.
No, I don't think we have any reason to consider it a fake. I think it's one of these things where people build up this image in their heads of what it is to discover a manuscript. And you think you're going into this really chaotic library and you're having to search through high and low.
National treasure.
Everything. Yeah, I'm really sorry to tell you that it's not like that. I hate to disappoint you, but and this is the thing, because people have always had this idea. So the library that Torgan found this manuscript in was in a shrine. It was in the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad, which was an important religious site, but it was also a site that you couldn't enter unless you were Muslim. There's lots of accounts of Western Europeans in very classic Western European style trying to disguise themselves as Muslims to get in there, or pretending to convert half-heartedly so that they can have access to the shrine and to the library. And it all absolutely reeks of colonialism and everything dodgy. But it means that when Torgun goes in and finds something, they're like, oh, well, that was because he was a Muslim. He sought refuge in the shrine. Absolutely not true. The library had been closed because it was Persian New Year, so initially he couldn't get access. And he had to write to the most important people in the Iranian government to be granted access anyway. It wasn't like it was easy to walk into. But the library had a catalogue, and the catalogue had previously been published by a Russian Orientalist who couldn't get into it. And he'd listed the title of this manuscript. And then at the end of this whole list of catalogued items, he said, oh, it looks like there's nothing good to be had in this anyway, so it doesn't matter that we're not allowed in.
Okay.
So it had been catalogued. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. And it was just that it needed somebody to go in and look and say, oh, yeah, collection of geographical works. Let's look at that manuscript and see what it contains. So he didn't know Ibn Fadlan was going to be there, but it was easy enough to browse the catalogue and think, oh, okay, that manuscript sounds interesting. I wonder what geographical works it contains. So yeah, not quite national treasure, I'm afraid.
Unfortunately,
but he
not.
did stay up all night. He did stay up all night making a handwritten copy of the manuscript because he didn't have a camera.
Well, that's rock and roll enough for me. Let's wrap up the main show, because I have so many questions I still want to ask, but we'll save them for the
question, Dan.
Q&A after. We also have a question that we meant to ask you at the start, but we didn't,
because we always forget
now on the spot. But in the Q&A, one of the questions I do want to ask, and this is separate to the question, but I'm going to tease it anyway for people, and then you can think about it as well, is, do you think that maybe, don't answer this now, do you think maybe there are more sources out there that maybe haven't come to light? Is it possible that, I don't know the connections between the Arabic world and then, like, they're looking for Scandinavian links, and is it possible that there are stuff that's maybe overlooked? There's just not that kind of investment into finding these things. And then academia. When I started this podcast, I thought academia spoke to each other. I thought everybody knew everything. I thought there was a database somewhere, like a central hub computer where all the world's information was put into, and it was neatly catalogued, and then scholars just pulled out bits from where they needed to look at, and it was just neat and tidy. That's what I thought.
Could you imagine?
And then I found out it is a ball of yarn.
A mess.
And yeah, so now I'm thinking, well, is there maybe stuff out there? But we'll come back to that.
Okay.
The question is, if we had a time machine right now, and you could go back to the Viking Age, and you could just find out one thing for certain, what do you think it would be? Just off the top of the head, like, is there just one burning question you've always wanted to know? Is Ibn Fadlan real?
I have too many questions. This is the problem.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think at the moment the questions that keep me up at night have to do with a different Arabic source. They have to do with an Arabic source from the 9th century that describes the Rus traveling on camelback to Baghdad to do their trading there. And
fun.
Every single sentence of this source throws up so many questions that you can just dig into. You could just the tiny paragraph that describes the Rus, and that's just one tiny aspect of the whole book. Every single sentence you're like, oh yeah, but that. And so I think maybe seeing Baghdad and seeing how the Rus are actually interacting and how they're dealing with things, because this source says that the Rus pretend to be Christian so that they can pay the poll tax rather than different taxation conditions. And that's all quite thorny in terms of what that means, but it also implies that the Rus are there quite long term for that to be an issue. But that also means that you can't get away with just kind of standing at the gate and going, oh yeah, see, Christian, let me in. That means you've got to do something meaningful. So I'd kind of want to see what's actually going on there. Sure, it would be great to know if Ibn Fadlan's real, but if I time it right, maybe maybe somebody knows about somebody's kid named Ahmad, and that can confirm that. But I think Baghdad and exactly what's going on with the traders would be
What a perfect way to set up a second episode. And you come back and tell us all about that.
Vikings on camels, or I'm sorry, Rus on camels. Fun.
Yeah, it's a real evocative image.
Yeah, it is. Okay, well, let's wrap this up and then we'll let people ask you some questions. Do you have a place where people can follow you or read your work? Any big facing image?
Yeah, I'm not really on any social media platforms at the moment.
Good for you.
It makes life a lot quieter. That's quite nice. My work's available on Google Scholar, or at least you could see what work I have out there. I've written a small book about funerals and sacrifice in the Arabic and Persian sources. So there's that, which I think is about £20 in paperback or as an ebook. Okay. So it's not particularly offensive for an academic text. No. But my university profile page, I'm at Uppsala University at the moment, and that also has links to other things that I've done in the grand scheme of things.
Perfect. Mags, where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at ArcuMags, Arcu with a K.
There you go. For me, it's Daniel_Farrand1, Horns of Odin for the business, and then Nordic Mythology podcast across the board. And go and check it out on YouTube. Hit the little subscribe button, and you get to see our lovely faces as we discuss. Give that extra dimension to the conversation. But Tonicha, this has been wonderful. I feel like I know so much more. Well, actually, I feel like I know less, but that is
less but more.
Purpose. Yes, less but more. That's the purpose.
Sometimes less is more. Yeah.
Exactly.
I've been
perfect.
That's been happening to me for years at this point through this podcast, that every time I think I know something, somebody comes along and is just like, no. It's the most rudimentary thing that I think, this has to be true. We know this. And then somebody's like, no, actually, forget
That's where
it.
They get you.
Yeah.
Just doing like a full Socrates moment on you. The only thing I know for sure is that I don't know shit. Me paraphrasing Socrates heavily.
At this point, I'm just like, I give up. It's all. Are the Vikings even real? Did they exist? I have no idea anymore. But it's a fun topic.